Grace Mitchell adjusted her simple navy dress as she stood outside the gates of the Belmont Country Club, watching her sister Caroline's wedding guests arrive in luxury vehicles for what had been billed as the social event of the season. The invitation had come with a carefully worded explanation that space limitations prevented Grace from bringing a guest, despite the obvious abundance of empty chairs visible through the venue's floor-to-ceiling windows. At 31, Grace had grown accustomed to being treated as the family's social liability at prestigious gatherings. While Caroline had built her identity around marrying into the Morrison shipping fortune and their brother James worked as a hedge fund manager, Grace's career in what the family vaguely understood as government security work was consistently viewed as insufficiently glamorous for high society events. "Grace, darling, you understand why we had to be so selective about the guest list," Caroline had explained during their last phone conversation. "The Morrison family has very specific expectations about wedding attendees, and frankly, your government job doesn't quite fit the social caliber they're accustomed to. It's nothing personal, we just need to maintain certain standards." The family's embarrassment about Grace's career had intensified as Caroline's engagement to Harrison Morrison III elevated their social standing within the East Coast elite. Grace's modest government salary, her security-related travel restrictions, and her inability to discuss work details had been interpreted as evidence of a dead-end bureaucratic position that reflected poorly on the Mitchell family's newfound status. The problem with Grace, their mother Elizabeth Mitchell had confided to the Morrison family matriarch, is that she's never understood the importance of building a career that opens social doors. Caroline's marketing work brought her into contact with the right circles, while Grace seems content with whatever administrative role she has in Washington. Caroline's wedding represented everything the family associated with true success, a venue that required substantial social connections to book, guests who represented old money and political influence, and media coverage from society publications that would cement their arrival among America's established elite. Grace's presence with her modest lifestyle and undefined government work threatened the carefully cultivated image Caroline had spent months perfecting. "We're not excluding Grace out of malice," James had explained to his hedge fund colleagues who were attending the wedding. "It's just that this particular event requires a certain level of social sophistication. Grace works in government security, perfectly respectable, but not exactly the kind of career that resonates with the Morrison family's social circle." Grace nodded politely at the country club's entrance, checking her phone for messages that included several urgent notifications from her National Security Council liaison about protocol adjustments for an undisclosed high-priority event. The irony of being excluded from a social gathering due to insufficient prestige while managing communications that affected national security policy was not lost on her, but explaining this would have violated the confidentiality requirements that governed her daily work. The family had constructed an elaborate narrative where Caroline's marketing success and James's financial career represented sophisticated professional achievement, while Grace's government work was characterized as low-level administrative employment that lacked the social currency necessary for elite networking events. As the wedding ceremony approached, Grace observed the careful choreography of social positioning that defined Caroline's vision of perfect elite networking. Old money families mingled with political donors while hedge fund managers and shipping executives formed the kind of influential guest list that validated the Morrison family's decision to welcome the Mitchells into their social circle. "Caroline's wedding represents everything our family has worked toward," Elizabeth announced to relatives who had traveled from across the country. "The Morrison connections open doors to the kind of social influence that creates generational opportunities. Grace's government work is steady, but it doesn't contribute to our collective social advancement." Harrison Morrison Jr., the groom's father, had been particularly impressed with the Mitchell family's integration into East Coast society. Caroline's marketing achievements and James's hedge fund success suggested the kind of professional sophistication that complemented the Morrison shipping legacy, while Grace's absence from key planning events had been diplomatically explained as work-related scheduling conflicts. "The thing about government employment," Morrison Jr. had told his country club associates, "is that it attracts people who prioritize security over advancement. Grace is probably competent at whatever administrative role she performs, but she lacks the entrepreneurial ambition that characterizes successful families like ours." James had embraced his role as the family's financial representative, networking with Morrison business associates while occasionally mentioning his concern about Grace's limited career trajectory. His hedge fund work had generated exactly the kind of visible success that impressed the Morrison family's social circle. Grace's challenge, James explained to a group of investment managers, is that she's never learned to leverage her intelligence for wealth creation or social positioning. Government work might provide job security, but it doesn't build the kind of professional relationships that advance family interests. The wedding's exclusivity had reached peak significance as society photographers documented the guest list for publications that would establish Caroline's marriage as a defining moment in East Coast elite social circles. Banking families, shipping dynasties, and political influencers represented the kind of network that could advance multiple generations of Mitchell family interests. Caroline's triumph was complete as she surveyed the assembled guests from families whose names appeared on museum wings and university buildings. The wedding represented not just personal happiness but strategic social positioning that would benefit her entire family for decades. "What I'm most proud of," Caroline told the Society reporter, "is how this celebration brings together families who understand the importance of maintaining America's cultural and business leadership traditions. These are the relationships that shape policy and create lasting influence." The guest list had been curated to exclude anyone who might diminish the event's social significance or political influence, making Grace's government work seem particularly problematic given its apparent lack of connection to elite networking opportunities. At exactly 4:45 as Caroline prepared for her processional entrance, a convoy of black SUVs bearing government plates arrived at the Belmont Country Club with unmistakable federal authority. The lead vehicles disgorged Secret Service agents who immediately began coordinating with club security about implementing emergency protocols that transformed the wedding venue into a secured federal facility. Caroline's perfectly choreographed ceremony came to an abrupt halt as guests recognized the distinctive communication equipment and coordinated movements that indicated presidential-level security operations. The society wedding was suddenly superseded by federal procedures that none of the assembled elite had ever witnessed firsthand. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the Secret Service detail leader, "we need to implement temporary security measures for a high-priority federal consultation. Ms. Grace Mitchell is required for immediate briefing with the President regarding developing national security matters." The Morrison family stared in stunned disbelief as additional security personnel established a command perimeter around the country club's main entrance. Harrison Morrison Jr. found his voice first. "I'm sorry, did you say Grace Mitchell? She works in government administration." Ms. Mitchell serves as Deputy Director of the National Security Council's Crisis Response Division, the agent explained with professional precision. She also holds emergency advisory positions with the Defense Department and Homeland Security. The President has specifically requested her assessment of current threat developments. Elizabeth Mitchell gripped her husband's arm as the security team detailed Grace's professional responsibilities. "The developing situation requires immediate consultation with our most senior crisis management leadership. Ms. Mitchell's expertise in threat assessment makes her indispensable during national security emergencies." James stared in horror as the agent continued. "Air Force One is currently en route to Hartford-Bradley Airport. The President needs Ms. Mitchell's analysis before proceeding with tonight's emergency cabinet meeting regarding international crisis response protocols." Caroline's wedding guests, banking executives, shipping magnates, and political donors, watched in fascination as the Secret Service transformed their exclusive social gathering into a federal operations center. The government administrative work they had dismissed was revealed as national security leadership that commanded presidential attention. Ms. Mitchell maintains top-secret/SCI clearance and serves on the National Security Council's emergency response team, the agent confirmed to the bewildered wedding party. Her recommendations directly influence presidential decisions during international crisis situations. The President's emergency consultation transformed Caroline's exclusive wedding into an elaborate demonstration of the family's spectacular misunderstanding of professional achievement and national importance. The society guests who had represented the pinnacle of East Coast elite influence found themselves excluded from security briefings that exceeded their clearance levels while Grace coordinated federal crisis response from the country club's converted conference facilities. Caroline's carefully curated social triumph became the backdrop for presidential-level national security operations that relegated her shipping fortune connections to peripheral observer status. The government administrative work, that had been too socially insignificant for wedding inclusion, was revealed as crisis management expertise that influenced decisions affecting global stability. The Morrison family's old money prestige and political donor status proved utterly irrelevant to national security operations that Grace had been managing while they worried about her career's social adequacy. Harrison Morrison Jr.'s shipping empire and James's hedge fund achievements were exposed as modest business success compared to Grace's influence on presidential policy during international crises. Within hours, society reporters who had planned to document Caroline's wedding triumph found themselves covering a national security event that demonstrated the complete inadequacy of their understanding about real power and influence. The guest list that had seemed so impressive was revealed as social networking that paled in comparison to Grace's professional relationships within the highest levels of federal government. The country club venue that had been too exclusive for Grace to bring a guest became the temporary command center for presidential crisis consultations that none of the assembled elite possessed sufficient security clearance to witness. Caroline's wedding reception was relocated to accommodate classified briefings that superseded any social gathering the Morrison family had ever hosted. Grace maintained her characteristic discretion about classified responsibilities, continuing her National Security Council duties while her family adjusted to the reality that their social advancement strategies had been irrelevant to someone whose professional influence exceeded their collective achievements by several orders of magnitude. The Belmont Country Club wedding became a permanent reminder that their understanding of social success had systematically excluded the most accomplished family member, someone whose government work protected national security while they practiced elementary elite networking at country club gatherings that meant nothing to people who actually shaped American policy and international relations. The space limitations that had prevented Grace from bringing a guest were exposed as social ignorance about someone whose security requirements routinely commanded presidential attention and federal resources that dwarfed anything the Morrison shipping fortune could provide.